Chapter 1, The Rebellion of the Mahdi. The northeastern quarter of the continent of Africa is drained and watered by the Nile. Among and about the headstreams and tributaries of this mighty river lie the wide and fertile provinces of the Egyptian Sudan. Situated in the very center of the land, these remote regions are on every side divided from the seas by 500 miles of mountain, swamp, or desert. The great river is their only means of growth, their only channel of progress. It is by the Nile alone that their commerce can reach the outer markets, or European civilization can penetrate the inner darkness. The Sudan is joined to Egypt by the Nile, as a diver is connected with the surface by his air pipe. Without it there is only suffocation. Aut Nilus, aut Nile. The town of Khartoum, at the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, is the point on which the trade of the South must inevitably converge. It is the great spout through which the merchandise collected from a wide area streams northwards to the Mediterranean shore. It marks the extreme northern limit of the fertile Sudan. Between Khartoum and Aswan the river flows for 1,200 miles through deserts of surpassing desolation. At last the wilderness recedes and the living world broadens out again into Egypt and the Delta. It is with events that have occurred in the intervening waste that these pages are concerned. The real Sudan, known to the statesman and the explorer, lies far to the south, moist, undulating, and exuberant. But there is another Sudan, which some mistake for the true, whose solitudes oppress the Nile from the Egyptian frontier to Omdurman. This is the Sudan of the soldier. Destitute of wealth or future, it is rich in history. The names of its squalid villages are familiar to distant and enlightened peoples. The barrenness of its scenery has been drawn by skillful pen and pencil. Its ample deserts have tasted the blood of brave men. Its hot, black rocks have witnessed famous tragedies. It is the scene of the war. This great tract, which may conveniently be called the military Sudan, stretches with apparent indefiniteness over the face of the continent. Level plains of smooth sand, a little rosier than buff, a little paler than salmon, are interrupted only by occasional peaks of rock, black, stark, and shapeless. Rainless storms dance tirelessly over the hot, crisp surface of the ground. The fine sand, driven by the wind, gathers into deep drifts, and silts among the dark rocks of the hills, exactly as snow hangs about an alpine summit. Only it is a fiery snow, such as might fall in hell. The earth burns with the quenchless thirst of ages, and in the steel blue sky scarcely a cloud obstructs the unrelenting triumph of the sun. Through the desert flows the river, a thread of blue silk drawn across an enormous brown drugget, and even this thread is brown for half the year. Where the water laps the sand and soaks into the banks there grows an avenue of vegetation, which seems very beautiful and luxuriant by contrast with what lies beyond. The Nile, through all the 3,000 miles of its course vital to everything that lives beside it, is never so precious as here. The traveler clings to the strong river as to an old friend, staunch in the hour of need. All the world blazes, but here is shade. The deserts are hot, but the Nile is cool. The land is parched, but here is abundant water. The picture painted in burnt sienna is relieved by a grateful flash of green. Yet he who had not seen the desert, or felt the sun heavily on his shoulders, would hardly admire the fertility of the riparian scrub. Unnourishing reeds and grasses grow rank and coarse from the water's edge. The dark, rotten soil between the tussocks is cracked and granulated by the drying up of the annual flood. The character of the vegetation is inhospitable. Thorn bushes, bristling like hedgehogs and thriving arrogantly, everywhere predominate, and with their prickly tangles obstruct or forbid the path. Only the palms by the brink are kindly, and men journeying along the Nile must look often towards their bushy tops, where among the spreading foliage the red and yellow glint of date clusters proclaims the ripening of a generous crop, and protests that nature is not always mischievous and cruel. The banks of the Nile, except by contrast with the desert, display an abundance of barrenness. Their characteristic is monotony. Their attraction is their sadness. Yet there is 1 hour when all is changed. Just before the sun sets towards the western cliffs, a delicious flush brightens and enlivens the landscape. It is as though some titanic artist in an hour of inspiration were retouching the picture, painting in dark purple shadows among the rocks, strengthening the lights on the sands, gilding and beautifying everything, and making the whole scene live. The river, whose windings make it look like a lake, turns from muddy brown to silver gray. The sky from a dull blue deepens into violet in the west. Everything under that magic touch becomes vivid and alive. And then the sun sinks altogether behind the rocks, the colors fade out of the sky, the flush off the sands, and gradually everything darkens and grows gray like a man's cheek when he is bleeding to death. We are left sad and sorrowful in the dark, until the stars light up and remind us that there is always something beyond. In a land whose beauty is the beauty of a moment, whose face is desolate, and whose character is strangely stern, the curse of war was hardly needed to produce a melancholy effect. Why should there be caustic plants where everything is hot and burning? In deserts where thirst is enthroned, and where the rocks and sand appeal to a pitiless sky for moisture, it was a savage trick to add the mockery of mirage. The area multiplies the desolation. There is life only by the Nile. If a man were to leave the river, he might journey westward and find no human habitation, nor the smoke of a cooking fire, except the lonely tent of a Kababish Arab or the encampment of a trader's caravan, till he reached the coastline of America. Or he might go east and find nothing but sand and sea and sun until Bombay rose above the horizon. The thread of fresh water is itself solitary in regions where all living things lack company. In the account of the river war, the Nile is naturally supreme. It is the great melody that recurs throughout the whole opera. The general purposing military operations, the statesman who would decide upon grave policies, and the reader desirous of studying the course and results of either, must think of the Nile. It is the life of the lands through which it flows. It is the cause of the war, the means by which we fight, the end at which we aim. Imagination should paint the river through every page in the story. It glitters between the palm trees during the actions. It is the explanation of nearly every military movement. By its banks the armies camp at night. Backed or flanked on its unfordable stream they offer, or accept battle by day. To its brink, morning and evening, long lines of camels, horses, mules, and slaughter cattle hurry eagerly. Emir and dervish, officer and soldier, friend and foe, kneel alike to this god of ancient Egypt and draw each day their daily water. In goatskin or canteen. Without the river none would have started. Without it none might have continued. Without it none could ever have returned. All who journey on the Nile, whether in commerce or war, will pay their tribute of respect and gratitude, for the great river has befriended all races and every age. Through all the centuries it has performed the annual miracle of its flood. Every year when the rains fall and the mountain snows of Central Africa begin to melt, the head streams become torrents and the great lakes are filled to the brim. A vast expanse of low, swampy lands, crossed by secondary channels and flooded for many miles, regulates the flow, and by a sponge-like action prevents the excess of one year from causing the deficiency of the next. Far away in Egypt, prince, priest, and peasant look southwards with anxious attention for the fluctuating yet certain rise. Gradually the flood begins. The Bahr el Ghazal from a channel of stagnant pools and marshes becomes a broad and navigable stream. The Sobit and the Atbara from dry watercourses with occasional pools, in which the fish and crocodiles are crowded, turn to rushing rivers. But all this is remote from Egypt. After its confluence with the Atbara, no drop of water reaches the Nile, and it flows for 700 miles through the sands or rushes in cataracts among the rocks of the Nubian desert. Nevertheless, in spite of the tremendous diminution in volume caused by the dryness of the earth, and air and the heat of the sun, all of which drink greedily the river below Aswan, is sufficiently great to supply 9 millions of people with as much water as their utmost science and energies can draw, and yet to pour into the Mediterranean a low water surplus current of 61,500 cubic feet per second. Nor is its water its only gift. As the Nile rises, its complexion is changed. The clear blue river becomes thick and red, laden with the magic mud that can raise cities from the desert sand and make the wilderness a garden. The geographer may still in the arrogance of science describe the Nile as a great, steady-flowing river, fed by the rains of the tropics, controlled by the existence of a vast head reservoir, and several areas of repose, and annually flooded by the accession of a great body of water with which its eastern tributaries are flushed. Encyclopedia Britannica. But all who have drunk deeply of its soft yet fateful waters, fateful, since they give both life and death, will understand why the old Egyptians worshipped the river, nor will they even in modern days easily dissociate from their minds a feeling of mystic reverence. South of Khartoum and of the military Sudan, the land becomes more fruitful. The tributaries of the Nile multiply the areas of riparian fertility. A considerable rainfall, increasing as the equator is approached, enables the intervening spaces to support vegetation, and consequently human life. The greater part of the country is feverish and unhealthy, nor can Europeans long sustain the attacks of its climate. Nevertheless, it is by no means valueless. On the east, the province of Sennar used to produce abundant grain, and might easily produce no less abundant cotton. Westward, the vast territories of Kordofan and Darfur afford grazing grounds to a multitude of cattle, and give means of livelihood to great numbers of Bagara, or cowherd Arabs, who may also pursue with activity and stratagem the fleet giraffe and the still fleeter ostrich. To the southeast lies Bahr el-Ghazal, a great tract of country occupied by dense woods and plentifully watered. Further south, and nearer the equator, the forests and marshes become exuberant with tropical growths, and the whole face of the land is moist and green. Amid groves of gigantic trees, and through plains of high waving grass, the stately elephant roams in herds, which occasionally number 400, hardly ever disturbed by a well-armed hunter. The ivory of their tusks constitutes the wealth of the equatorial province. So greatly they abound that Emin Pasha is provoked to complain of a pest of these valuable pachyderms. Life of Emin Pasha, Volume 1, Chapter 9, and although they are only assailed by the natives with spear and gun, no less than 12,000 hundredweight of ivory has been exported in a single year. Ibid. All other kinds of large beasts known to man inhabit these obscure retreats. The fierce rhinoceros crashes through the undergrowth. Among the reeds of melancholy swamps, huge hippopotami, crocodiles, and buffaloes prosper and increase. Antelope of every known and many unclassified species, serpents of peculiar venom, countless. Millions of birds, butterflies, and beetles are among the offspring of prolific nature. And the daring sportsman, who should survive his expedition, would not fail to add to the achievements of science and the extent of natural history, as well as to his own reputation. The human inhabitants of the Sudan would not, but for their vices and misfortunes, be disproportioned in numbers to the fauna or less happy. War, slavery, and oppression have, however, afflicted them until the total population of the whole country does not exceed, at the most liberal estimate, 3 million souls. The huge area contains many differences of climate and conditions, and these have produced peculiar and diverse breeds of men. The Sudanese are of many tribes, but two main races can be clearly distinguished: the aboriginal natives and the Arab settlers. The indigenous inhabitants of the country were Negroes as black as coal. Strong, virile, and simple-minded savages, they lived as we may imagine prehistoric men, hunting, fighting, marrying, and dying, with no ideas beyond the gratification of their physical desires, and no fears save those engendered by ghosts, witchcraft, the worship of ancestors, and other forms of superstition common among peoples of low development. They displayed the virtues of barbarism. They were brave and honest. The smallness of their intelligence excused the degradation of their habits. Their ignorance secured their innocence. Yet their eulogy must be short, for though their customs, language, and appearance vary with the districts they inhabit and the subdivisions to which they belong, the history of all is a confused legend of strife and misery. Their natures are uniformly cruel and thriftless, and their condition is one of equal squalor and want. Although the Negroes are the more numerous, the Arabs exceed in power. The bravery of the Aboriginals is outweighed by the intelligence of the invaders and their superior force of character. During the 2nd century of the Mohammedan era, when the inhabitants of Arabia went forth to conquer the world, one adventurous army struck south. The first pioneers were followed at intervals by continual immigrations of Arabs, not only from Arabia, but also across the deserts from Egypt and Morocco. The element thus introduced has spread and is spreading throughout the Sudan, as water soaks into a dry sponge. The Aboriginals absorbed the invaders they could not repel. The stronger race imposed its customs and language on the Negroes. The vigor of their blood sensibly altered the facial appearance of the Sudanese. For more than 1,000 years the influence of Mohammedanism, which appears to possess a strange fascination for Negroid races, has been permeating the Sudan and, although ignorance and natural obstacles impede the progress of new ideas, the whole of the black race is gradually adopting the new religion and developing Arab characteristics. In the districts of the north, where the original invaders settled, the evolution is complete, and the Arabs of the Sudan are a race formed by the interbreeding of Negro and Arab, and yet distinct from both. In the more remote and inaccessible regions, which lie to the south and west, the Negro race remains as yet unchanged by the Arab influence. And between these extremes every degree of mixture is to be found. In some tribes pure Arabic is spoken, and prior to the rise of the Mahdi the orthodox Muslim faith was practiced. In others Arabic has merely modified the ancient dialects, and the Mohammedan religion has been adapted to the older superstitions. But although the gap between the Arab Negro and the Negro pure is thus filled by every intermediate blend, the two races were at an early date quite distinct. The qualities of mongrels are rarely admirable, and the mixture of the Arab and Negro types has produced a debased and cruel breed, more shocking because they are more intelligent than the primitive savages. The stronger race soon began to prey upon the simple Aboriginals. Some of the Arab tribes were camel breeders, some were goat herds, some were Bagaras or cow herds. But all, without exception, were hunters of men. To the great slave market, at Jeddah a continual stream of Negro captives has flowed for hundreds of years. The invention of gunpowder and the adoption by the Arabs of firearms facilitated the traffic by placing the ignorant Negroes at a further disadvantage. Thus the situation in the Sudan for several centuries may be summed up as follows. The dominant race of Arab invaders was unceasingly spreading its blood, religion, customs, and language among the black Aboriginal population, and at the same time it harried and enslaved them. The state of society that arose out of this may be easily imagined. The warlike Arab tribes fought and brawled among themselves in ceaseless feud and strife. The Negroes trembled in apprehension of capture, or rose locally against their oppressors. Occasionally an important sheikh would effect the combination of many tribes, and a kingdom came into existence, a community consisting of a military class, armed with guns, and of multitudes of slaves, at once their servants and their merchandise, and sometimes trained as soldiers. The dominion might prosper viciously till it was overthrown by some more powerful league. All this was unheeded by the outer world, from which the Sudan is separated by the deserts, and it seemed that the slow, painful course of development would be unaided and uninterrupted. But at last the populations of Europe changed. Another civilization reared itself above the ruins of Roman triumph and Mohammedan aspiration, a civilization more powerful, more glorious, but no less aggressive. The impulse of conquest, which hurried the French and English to Canada and the Indies, which sent the Dutch to the Cape and the Spaniards to Peru, spread to Africa, and led the Egyptians to the Sudan. In the year 1819, Muhammad Ali, availing himself of the disorders alike as an excuse and an opportunity, sent his son Ismail up the Nile with a great army. The Arab tribes, torn by dissension, exhausted by 30 years of general war, and no longer inspired by their neglected religion, offered a weak resistance. Their slaves, having known the worst of life, were apathetic. The black aboriginals were silent and afraid. The whole vast territory was conquered with very little fighting, and the victorious army, leaving garrisons, returned in triumph to the Delta. What enterprise that an enlightened community may attempt is more noble and more profitable than the reclamation from barbarism of fertile regions and large populations? To give peace to warring tribes, to administer justice where all was violence, to strike the chains off the slave, to draw the richness from the soil, to plant the earliest seeds of commerce and learning, to increase in whole peoples their capacities for pleasure and diminish their chances of pain. What more beautiful ideal or more valuable reward can inspire human effort? The act is virtuous, the exercise invigorating, and the result often extremely profitable. Yet as the mind turns from the wonderful cloudland of aspiration to the ugly scaffolding of attempt and achievement, a succession of opposite ideas arises. Industrious races are displayed stinted and starved for the sake of an expensive imperialism, which they can only enjoy if they are well fed. Wild peoples, ignorant of their barbarism, callous of suffering, careless of life, but tenacious of liberty, are seen to resist with fury the philanthropic invaders, and to perish in thousands before they are convinced of their mistake. The inevitable gap between conquest and dominion becomes filled with the figures of the greedy trader, the inopportune missionary, the ambitious soldier, and the lying speculator, who disquiet the minds of the conquered and excite the sordid appetites of the conquerors. And as the eye of thought rests on these sinister features, it hardly seems possible for us to believe that any fair prospect is approached by so foul a path. From 1819 to 1883, Egypt ruled the Sudan. Her rule was not kindly, wise, or profitable. Its aim was to exploit, not to improve the local population. The miseries of the people were aggravated rather than lessened, but they were concealed. For the rough injustice of the sort there were substituted the intricacies of corruption and bribery. Violence and plunder were more hideous, since they were cloaked with legality and armed with authority. The land was undeveloped and poor. It barely sustained its inhabitants. The additional burden of a considerable foreign garrison and a crowd of rapacious officials increased the severity of the economic conditions. Scarcity was frequent. Famines were periodical. Corrupt and incapable governors-general succeeded each other at Khartoum with bewildering rapidity. The constant changes, while they prevented the continuity of any wise policy, did not interrupt the misrule. With hardly any exceptions, the Pashas were consistent in oppression. The success of their administration was measured by the ministries in Egypt by the amount of money they could extort from the natives, among the officials in the Sudan, by the number of useless offices they could create. There were a few bright examples of honest men, but these, by providing a contrast, only increased the discontents. The rule of Egypt was iniquitous, yet it preserved the magnificent appearance of imperial dominion. The Egyptian proconsul lived in state at the confluence of the Niles. The representatives of foreign powers established themselves in the city. The trade of the south converged upon Khartoum. Thither the subordinate governors, beys and mudirs, repaired at intervals to report the state of their provinces and to receive instructions. Thither were sent the ivory of Equatoria, the ostrich feathers of Kordofan, gum from Darfur, grain from Sennar, and taxes collected from all the regions. Strange beasts, entrapped in the swamps and forests, passed through the capital on their journey to Cairo and Europe. Complex and imposing reports of revenue and expenditure were annually compiled. An elaborate and dignified correspondence was maintained between Egypt and its great dependency. The casual observer, astonished at the unusual capacity for government displayed by an Oriental people, was tempted to accept the famous assertion, which Nubar Pasha put into the mouth of the Khedive Ismail: "We are no longer in Africa, but in Europe." Yet all was a hateful sham. The government of the Egyptians in these far-off countries is nothing else but one of brigandage of the very worst description. Colonel Gordon, in Central Africa, April 11, 1879. The arbitrary and excessive taxes were collected only at the point of the bayonet. If a petty chief fell into arrears, his neighbors were raised against him. If an Arab tribe were recalcitrant, a military expedition was dispatched. Moreover, the ability of the Arabs to pay depended on their success as slave hunters. When there had been a good catch, the revenue profited. The Egyptian government had joined the International League against the slave trade. They combined, however, indirectly but deliberately, to make money out of it. Egypt, number 11, 1883. In the miserable, harassing warfare that accompanied the collection of taxes, the viceregal commanders gained more from fraud than force. No subterfuge, no treachery, was too mean for them to adopt, no oath or treaty was too sacred for them to break. Their methods were cruel, and if honor did not impede the achievement, mercy did not restrict the effects of their inglorious successes, and the effete administrators delighted to order their timid soldiery to carry out the most savage executions. The political methods and social style of the governors-general were imitated more, or less exactly, by the subordinate officials according to their degree in the provinces. Since they were completely hidden from the eye of civilization, they enjoyed a greater license in their administration. As their education was inferior, so their habits became more gross. Meanwhile, the volcano on which they disported themselves was ominously silent. The Arab tribes obeyed, and the black population cowered. The authority of a tyrannical government was supported by the presence of a worthless army. Nearly 40,000 men were distributed among 8 main and numerous minor garrisons. Isolated in a roadless country by enormous distances and natural obstacles, and living in the midst of large savage populations of fanatical character and warlike habits, whose exasperation was yearly growing with their miseries, the viceregal forces might depend for their safety only on the skill of their officers, the excellence of their discipline, and the superiority of their weapons. But the Egyptian officers were at that time distinguished for nothing but their public incapacity and private misbehavior. The evil reputation of the Sudan and its climate deterred the more educated or more wealthy from serving in such distant regions, and none went south who could avoid it.